Captain Marcus Chen pressed his calloused hands against the cold metal of his ship's control panel, feeling the familiar vibrations of the aging engines through his fingertips. The Defiant Hope wasn't much to look at, a cobbled-together freight hauler with mismatched armor plating and jury-rigged weapon systems that most pilots would call a death trap. But she was his, and more importantly, she was humanity's last card to play. Outside the cockpit's scratched viewport, Kepler Station hung in the void like a dying star. What had once been humanity's greatest achievement in deep space, a massive research and military installation housing over 2 million souls, now flickered with the orange glow of fires burning through compromised hull sections. Emergency lights strobed frantically across its kilometer-long superstructure, painting the surrounding debris field in ghostly red shadows. The Zephyrian Collective had arrived 3 days ago, with a fleet that blotted out the stars. Their ships moved with the fluid grace of living creatures, hulls shifting and morphing as if made of liquid metal rather than solid matter. Each vessel was the size of a city, bristling with weapons that could crack planets and powered by technology that made humanity's greatest achievements look like stone tools. Marcus had watched from the outer system as the alien armada swept aside the Sol defense fleet like leaves in a hurricane. Admiral Richardson's flagship, the Terra's Pride, had lasted exactly 47 seconds against a single Zephyrian dreadnought before being carved apart by beams of coherent energy that seemed to bend space itself. The smaller human vessels fared even worse, their nuclear missiles and railgun rounds simply absorbed by enemy shields that rippled like water. Now, as Marcus guided his ship through the wreckage of humanity's military might, he could see the survivors streaming away from Kepler Station in whatever vessels they could find. Civilian transports, mining barges, even maintenance pods, anything with an engine was being pressed into service to evacuate the wounded and the terrified. But the Zephyrians weren't interested in slaughter. They wanted something far worse. Through his headset, Marcus could hear the alien transmission that had been broadcasting on all frequencies for the past hour. The Zephyrian commander's voice was like crystalline chimes, beautiful and terrible in its alien perfection. The translation software rendered its words in flat mechanical tones that somehow made the message even more chilling. Attention, human specimens. Your resistance has been noted and found inadequate. By order of the Collective, your species will be relocated to designated preservation zones where your biological and cultural development will be properly managed. Individual compliance will result in minimal trauma. Resistance will necessitate corrective measures. Preservation zones. The aliens weren't here to destroy humanity. They were here to cage it. To turn the entire human race into some kind of living museum exhibit, studied and controlled by beings who saw them as nothing more than interesting animals. Marcus's jaw tightened as he remembered the intelligence reports that had trickled in from the outer colonies. The Zephyrians had done this before to dozens of species across the galaxy, entire civilizations reduced to small, carefully managed populations living in artificial environments designed to preserve their primitive charm for alien researchers. The Defiant Hope shuddered as it passed through a cloud of metallic debris, pieces of destroyed warships bouncing off her reinforced hull. Marcus barely noticed, his attention focused on the tactical display showing the positions of the Zephyrian fleet. 27 capital ships arranged in a perfect sphere around Kepler Station, with countless smaller vessels weaving between them like schools of predatory fish. His comm system crackled to life, and the voice of Admiral Sarah Kowalski filled his cockpit. She was aboard one of the last functioning human vessels, a heavily damaged cruiser called the Indomitable that was limping toward the edge of the system with a hull breach the size of a football field. Marcus, what the hell are you doing out there? The evacuation order was clear. All remaining vessels are to retreat to the Alpha Centauri rendezvous point immediately. Marcus smiled grimly as he adjusted his course, angling the Defiant Hope not away from the alien fleet, but directly toward its center. Sorry, Admiral. I seem to have developed a sudden case of selective hearing. Chen, don't be an idiot. That rust bucket you're flying won't last 10 seconds against their point defense systems, let alone their main batteries. Get out of there while you still can. Can't do that, ma'am. See, I've been thinking about what that alien commander said, about how our resistance was inadequate. Really gets under my skin, you know? Being called inadequate by some crystalline space jellyfish who thinks humans belong in a zoo. Marcus could hear the frustration in the Admiral's voice. "One ship isn't going to make a difference, Captain. Even if you somehow manage to damage one of their vessels, they'd just adapt their defenses and move on. You'd be throwing your life away for nothing." "Maybe," Marcus said, his fingers dancing over the control panel as he began plotting an intercept course. "But here's the thing about humans, Admiral. We've got this bad habit of doing impossible things just to prove they can be done. Ask the Wright brothers about powered flight. Ask the Apollo crews about going to the moon. Ask any of the crazy bastards who decided to strap themselves to controlled explosions and ride them into space." The tactical display showed the Zephyrian fleet beginning to react to his approach. Several of the smaller vessels were breaking formation, moving to intercept him with the lazy confidence of predators who had never encountered prey that fought back effectively. Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out a small photograph, a picture of his daughter Emily, taken on her 8th birthday, just before he'd shipped out for this mission. She was grinning at the camera, her face covered in chocolate cake frosting and her eyes bright with the kind of fearless joy that only children possessed. Below the image, in her careful handwriting, she had written, "To Daddy, the bravest pilot in the whole galaxy." "The thing is," Marcus continued, slipping the photograph back into his pocket, "humans don't know when to quit. It's probably our biggest flaw and our greatest strength all rolled into one. We're too stubborn to accept defeat, too proud to bow down, and too damn ornery to go quietly into anyone's preservation zone." The first Zephyrian interceptor was closing fast, its weapons already beginning to charge with a sound like distant thunder. Marcus's hand moved to the throttle and the Defiant Hope's engines roared to full power. "This is Captain Marcus Chen of the Terran Colonial Navy," he announced on an open channel, knowing that every human and alien vessel in the system would hear his words. "I'm about to show these jellyfish why you should never underestimate a human pilot who's got absolutely nothing left to lose." The first energy beam lanced past the Defiant Hope so close that Marcus could smell the ozone in his recycled air. His hands moved across the controls with practiced precision, throwing the ship into a corkscrew dive that would have pulped any normal human under the crushing G-forces. But Marcus wasn't normal. None of the deep space pilots were. Years of gene therapy and surgical enhancement had turned them into something more than baseline human, built to survive in the unforgiving vacuum where even the slightest mistake meant death. The Zephyrian interceptor that had fired on him was a thing of terrible beauty, its hull rippling with bioluminescent patterns that shifted and flowed like living coral. It moved through space with an organic grace that made human ships look clumsy by comparison. But Marcus had spent his entire adult life studying alien tactics and technologies. He knew their patterns, understood their weaknesses, and, most importantly, he knew something they didn't. Humans fought dirty. "Come on, you crystalline bastard," Marcus muttered through gritted teeth as he pulled the Defiant Hope into a sharp banking turn that brought him directly into the interceptor's firing arc. "Let's dance." The alien ship's weapons lit up like a Christmas tree, sending a barrage of energy blasts toward his position. But Marcus had already committed to a maneuver that every tactical manual in the human fleet labeled as suicidal. He was flying directly toward the incoming fire, using microbursts from his maneuvering thrusters to thread the needle between the energy beams. The alien pilot, whatever it was, hesitated for a crucial half-second. It was a perfectly reasonable response. No sane creature would fly into concentrated weapons fire. But sanity was a luxury that Marcus had abandoned the moment he decided to charge an entire alien armada with nothing but an aging freight hauler and his own stubborn refusal to surrender. That half-second of hesitation was all Marcus needed. The Defiant Hope slipped through the gap in the enemy's firing pattern and closed to point-blank range. Her crude but effective plasma cannons spitting superheated death at the interceptor's elegant hull. The alien ship's shields flared and collapsed under the unexpected assault, and Marcus's follow-up salvo punched through the vessel's organic armor like a knife through tissue paper. The interceptor died beautifully, its bioluminescent patterns fading as it tumbled end over end into the void. But Marcus had no time to admire his handiwork. 3 more Zephyrian vessels were already converging on his position, their weapons charging with that distinctive sound like singing crystal. "Defiant Hope, this is Admiral Kowalski. I can't believe you actually did that. How the hell did you trade secrets?" "Ma'am," Marcus interrupted as he threw his ship into another impossible maneuver, using the gravity well of a nearby asteroid to slingshot past a spread of energy torpedoes. "But if you really want to know, it's simple. These aliens have been conquering species for so long that they've forgotten what it's like to fight. Someone who refuses to lose. The tactical display was lighting up with new contacts as more Zephyrian vessels broke off from their positions around Kepler Station. Marcus counted at least a dozen interceptors and 3 heavy cruisers, all moving to engage him with the methodical precision of a closing trap. Against any reasonable opponent, it would have been overkill. Against Marcus Chen, it was barely adequate. He'd spent 23 years as a deep space pilot, flying everything from survey scouts to heavy freighters through the most dangerous regions of known space. He'd navigated asteroid fields during solar storms, outrun pirate fleets in the Vega system, and once famously delivered critical medical supplies to a plague-stricken colony by flying his ship through the corona of an active star. Other pilots called him crazy, reckless, suicidal, and they were right. But they also called him the best pilot in the Terran Colonial Navy. And they were right about that, too. The Defiant Hope screamed through space like a thing possessed. Her jury-rigged engines pushed far beyond their safe operating parameters. Marcus had disabled most of the safety protocols years ago, along with the automatic systems that would have prevented him from pulling maneuvers that could kill him. The ship responded to his commands like an extension of his own body. Every thruster and control surface working in perfect harmony to keep him alive in the face of impossible odds. A Zephyrian heavy cruiser loomed ahead, its massive bulk bristling with weapons that could level a city. Marcus didn't even slow down. Instead, he aimed the Defiant Hope directly at the alien vessel's command section and opened fire with everything he had: plasma cannons, missile launchers, and even the ship's mining laser that he'd illegally modified for combat use. The cruiser's shields absorbed most of the damage, but Marcus wasn't trying to destroy the massive vessel. He was trying to get its attention, to draw its fire and keep it focused on him instead of the fleeing human refugees. The alien ship obliged, turning its primary batteries toward the tiny craft that dared to challenge it. What followed was a deadly game of cat and mouse played out at relativistic speeds. The Zephyrian cruiser was powerful and well-armed, but it was also massive and relatively slow. Marcus used that against it, staying close to the ship's hull where its heavy weapons couldn't track him, using his mining laser to carve through sensor arrays and communication nodes. "Impossible," came a transmission in perfect English. It was the voice of the Zephyrian fleet commander, that crystalline chime that somehow conveyed both amazement and anger. "Your vessel should have been destroyed. Your primitive technology cannot match our adaptive defenses." "Primitive?" Marcus laughed as he rolled the Defiant Hope between 2 massive weapon turrets, their energy beams passing so close that his hull plating began to glow cherry red. "Lady, you obviously haven't been paying attention to human history. We've been making impossible things work through sheer bloody-mindedness since we figured out how to bang rocks together." The truth was, his ship should have been destroyed a dozen times over. The Zephyrian weapons were more advanced than anything in the human arsenal, their targeting systems faster and more accurate than any computer ever built by human hands. But technology was only part of the equation in any fight. The other part was the mind behind the controls, and human minds had been shaped by millions of years of evolution that favored the cunning, the desperate, and the absolutely ruthless. Marcus pulled his ship into a spiraling climb that took him along the cruiser's upper hull, past weapon emplacements and sensor clusters that tracked his movement with mechanical precision. But precision wasn't everything. Sometimes what you needed was the ability to do something so completely insane that your enemy couldn't predict it. He found what he was looking for near the ship's stern, a cluster of what looked like communication arrays surrounding a particularly large and complex-looking structure. Without hesitation, Marcus aimed the Defiant Hope directly at the center of the cluster and fired his mining laser at maximum power. The beam punched through the alien hull like it was made of paper, and suddenly the massive cruiser began to list to one side. Emergency lights flashed along its hull as atmosphere vented from dozens of breaches. Marcus had found something important, though he wasn't entirely sure what. "That would be our primary navigation processor," the alien commander said, its voice now carrying a note of something that might have been respect. "An impressive display of tactical instinct for a primitive species." "Thanks for the compliment," Marcus replied as he pulled away from the crippled cruiser, already looking for his next target. "But if you think that was impressive, just wait until you see what I do for an encore." The damaged Zephyrian cruiser fell behind as Marcus pushed the Defiant Hope toward the heart of the alien formation. His ship's hull was scorched and pitted from near misses. Several of his secondary systems were offline, and his main engines were running at temperatures that would have terrified any sane engineer. But Marcus felt more alive than he had in years. This was what he'd been born for, the impossible dance between life and death that separated true pilots from mere drivers. Around him, the alien fleet was reorganizing with disturbing efficiency. The Zephyrians had clearly decided that a single human ship represented more of a threat than they'd initially calculated. Marcus watched on his tactical display as interceptors moved to form a closing sphere around his position, while the heavy cruisers established overlapping fields of fire. It was a textbook encirclement maneuver, executed with the kind of precision that spoke of thousands of years of military experience. Defiant Hope, this is the Indomitable. Marcus, we're seeing massive energy buildups from the alien fleet. They're preparing to focus their entire firepower on your position. You need to get out of there now. Admiral Kowalski's voice carried a note of desperation that Marcus had never heard from her before. The woman had commanded fleets through 3 separate alien incursions and never lost her cool. But watching a single pilot charge into impossible odds was apparently enough to crack even her legendary composure. "Can't do that, Admiral," Marcus replied as he rolled the Defiant Hope through a gap between 2 interceptors, their energy beams crossing just meters from his hull. "I'm having too much fun. Besides, I think I'm starting to get under their skin. Or whatever passes for skin on these jellyfish." The truth was more complicated. Marcus could see the tactical situation as clearly as anyone. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and flying a ship that had been obsolete before he was born. By any reasonable calculation, he should have been dead 10 minutes ago. But Marcus had spent his entire career proving that reasonable calculations didn't account for human stubbornness. More importantly, his suicidal charge was accomplishing something that no one had expected. The Zephyrian fleet, which had been methodically hunting down the fleeing human refugees, had turned almost its entire attention toward the single ship that dared to fight back. Every minute that Marcus stayed alive was another minute for civilian transports to reach the edge of the system and jump to safety. His proximity sensors screamed warnings as 3 interceptors closed in from different angles, their weapons charging in perfect synchronization. Marcus smiled grimly and did something that would have gotten him court-martialed in peacetime. He shut off his engines entirely, letting the Defiant Hope coast on momentum while he spun the ship end over end like a tumbling asteroid. The alien pilots hesitated, confused by the sudden change in their target's behavior. In that moment of uncertainty, Marcus reignited his engines at full power, sending the Defiant Hope rocketing toward the nearest interceptor at an angle that no computer could have calculated. His ship's reinforced bow struck the alien vessel, amidships, the impact sending both craft spinning wildly through space. But Marcus had been ready for the collision. His hands flew over the controls, using the spin to line up a perfect shot on the second interceptor. His plasma cannons spoke in unison, their superheated bolts punching through the alien ship's elegant hull and setting off a chain reaction that lit up the void like a dying star. The third interceptor tried to capitalize on Marcus's apparent vulnerability, swooping in for what should have been an easy kill. Instead, it found itself facing the Defiant Hope's stern weapons, a pair of modified mining charges that Marcus had rigged to function as crude but effective missiles. The alien pilot had no time to react before the explosives detonated against its hull, sending it tumbling away with significant structural damage. "Remarkable," came the Zephyrian commander's voice over the communication channel. "Your combat techniques are unorthodox. We have studied the tactics of 47 different species, but your methods defy all conventional wisdom." "That's because you've been fighting civilized species," Marcus replied, as he pulled away from the wreckage of his victims, already scanning for new threats. "Humans gave up on conventional wisdom about the same time we figured out that the universe was trying to kill us. We've been improvising ever since." The Defiant Hope shuddered as an energy beam clipped her starboard wing, sending up a shower of sparks from an overloaded power coupling. Marcus rerouted power from life support to his engines, accepting the risk of carbon dioxide poisoning in exchange for a few more seconds of maneuverability. It was the kind of trade-off that no alien computer would ever make. But then, alien. Computers had never been designed by a species crazy enough to live on a planet where everything from the weather to the wildlife was actively trying to kill them. Around him, the Zephyrian formation was tightening like a noose. Marcus counted at least 30 ships closing in on his position, their combined firepower enough to sterilize a small moon. But he wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. His sensors detected something interesting near the center of the alien formation. A ship larger than the others, its hull covered in the complex crystalline structures that seemed to be the Zephyrian equivalent of command and control systems. The fleet flagship, unless he missed his guess. The ship that contained the commander who had ordered humanity's enslavement. Marcus checked his weapon status and grimaced. He had maybe 30 seconds of sustained fire left in his plasma cannons, a handful of mining charges that might or might not detonate properly, and a mining laser that was already operating far beyond its design parameters. Against a flagship that probably mounted more armor than some human space stations, it wasn't much, but it was enough. It had to be. Admiral, this is Marcus. Tell me something. How many civilian ships are still in system? There was a pause before Admiral Kowalski responded. The last transport cleared the jump limit 2 minutes ago. All civilians are safely away. Marcus, please tell me you're not thinking about doing something even more insane than what you've already done. Marcus laughed as he locked his targeting system onto the Zephyrian flagship. Ma'am, I'm a human pilot with nothing left to lose and a ship that's held together by spare parts and stubbornness. Insane is pretty much all I've got left. The alien ships around him began to accelerate, sensing that their prey was making one final desperate run. Energy weapons charged with that distinctive crystalline singing, and Marcus could see torpedo launchers swiveling to track his movement. In seconds, the entire alien fleet would open fire simultaneously, creating a web of destruction that not even he could navigate. But Marcus had one last card to play, one final trick that he'd been saving for exactly this moment. His hand moved to a red switch that had been installed in his cockpit just before the mission began, a switch connected to a device that technically didn't exist according to any official records. This is for Emily, Marcus whispered, thinking of his daughter's chocolate-covered grin. And for every human who refuses to live in a cage. He flipped the switch. The device hidden in the Defiant, Hope's cargo bay, was officially classified as a theoretical quantum displacement generator, piece of experimental technology that existed only in the deepest black projects of human military research. Unofficially, the engineers who built it called it the God's Dice, because using it was essentially gambling with the fundamental laws of physics themselves. The theory was simple enough. By creating a localized distortion in space-time, the device could theoretically shift a small object, say, a single-person spacecraft, through quantum dimensions, allowing it to appear somewhere else entirely. The practice, however, was considerably more complicated. Test runs had resulted in everything, from complete molecular disintegration to the creation of temporal paradoxes that required extensive memory modification to contain. But Marcus wasn't thinking about the theoretical dangers as reality twisted around him like taffy. For a moment that lasted either microseconds or millennia, the defiant hope existed in all possible locations simultaneously. He could see himself dying in 1,000 different ways, vaporized by alien weapons, crushed by gravitational forces, scattered across 17 different dimensions. But he could also see himself succeeding, and Marcus Chen had always been the kind of man who focused on success rather than failure. The universe snapped back into focus with a sensation like being hit by lightning while falling off a cliff. Marcus found himself exactly where he'd intended to be, inside the Zephyrian defensive perimeter, less than 50 meters from the flagship's hull. So close that he could see the individual crystalline structures that covered the alien vessel's surface, each one pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that were almost hypnotically beautiful. The alien crew had approximately 2 seconds to register his presence before Marcus opened fire with everything he had. Plasma bolts and mining charges struck the flagship's hull in rapid succession, their explosions sending shockwaves through the massive vessel's superstructure. But Marcus wasn't trying to destroy the ship. That would have been impossible with his limited firepower. Instead, he was looking for something specific. Every ship, no matter how advanced, needed certain basic systems to function. Power generation, life support, navigation, communication. These were the vital organs that kept any spacecraft alive in the vacuum of space. And Marcus had spent years studying captured Zephyrian technology, learning to recognize the telltale signs of these critical systems. He found what he was looking for near the ship's center mass, a cluster of particularly large crystalline structures that pulsed with regular, rhythmic patterns. Power distribution nodes, unless he was very much mistaken, the alien equivalent of a reactor control room. Marcus armed his last mining charge and sent it streaking toward the target. The crude explosive device struck home with a flash that briefly outshone the nearby stars, and suddenly the flagship's hull was hemorrhaging atmosphere and energy discharges. Emergency lights began flashing across the massive vessel's surface as automated systems struggled to contain the cascade failures spreading through its power grid. Impossible, the Zephyrian commander's voice crackled over the communication channel, distorted now by static and electromagnetic interference. That technology should not exist. Our intelligence indicates that your species has not yet mastered quantum manipulation on a practical scale. Our intelligence was wrong about a lot of things, Marcus replied as he pulled the Defiant Hope away from the crippled flagship, already looking for his next target. For instance, we also thought your people were supposed to be invincible. Funny how these little misconceptions keep popping up. The truth was that the quantum displacement device represented humanity's greatest scientific achievement, a breakthrough that put human technology on par with anything the galaxy had to offer, but it had come at a cost that only a handful of people knew about. The power requirements were so enormous that each use drained the entire output of a fusion reactor for several hours. The device could only be used once before burning out its exotic matter components, and the stress it placed on the human nervous system meant that most test pilots suffered permanent neurological damage. Marcus could already feel the effects beginning, a tremor in his hands, a strange metallic taste in his mouth, and the kind of headache that felt like someone was driving nails into his skull. But he'd known the risks when he volunteered for this mission. They all had. The Zephyrian fleet was in chaos now. Their carefully ordered formation had collapsed as ships rushed to defend their damaged flagship, while others tried to track the impossible human vessel that seemed able to appear anywhere at will. Marcus smiled grimly as he watched alien interceptors collide with each other in their haste to respond to his attacks, their perfect coordination shattered by the introduction of a truly unpredictable element. Defiant Hope, this is Admiral Kowalski. Marcus, what the hell just happened? Our sensors showed some kind of massive energy discharge, and now the alien fleet looks like they've kicked a hornet's nest. Just giving our crystalline friends a little demonstration of human ingenuity, Admiral, though I have to admit, the hangover from this particular party trick is going to be legendary. Marcus's vision blurred for a moment as another wave of quantum-induced disorientation washed over him. The medical teams had warned him that using the displacement device would be like experiencing severe altitude sickness, vertigo, and a concussion all at the same time. They hadn't been exaggerating, but he wasn't done yet. The flagship was damaged but still functional, and the rest of the Zephyrian fleet was beginning to regroup around it. Marcus needed to keep the pressure up, to maintain the chaos that was his only advantage against such overwhelming odds. He selected his next target, a heavy cruiser that was moving to support the flagship. This time, he wouldn't need the quantum device. The aliens had made a mistake by clustering their ships so close together in response to his apparent teleportation. They were vulnerable to a more conventional attack. If he could just get into the right position. The Defiant Hope screamed through space toward the cruiser, her overtaxed engines leaving a trail of superheated plasma in her wake. Marcus could feel the ship's hull plates buckling under the stress, could hear the warning alarms that indicated multiple system failures throughout his vessel. But engineering tolerances were just suggestions when you were fighting for the future of your entire species. The cruiser's weapons opened fire as he approached, filling the space around him with deadly energy beams. But Marcus had been dodging alien weapons fire for the better part of an hour now, and he'd learned their patterns. The Zephyrians were precise, efficient, methodical, all qualities that made them predictable to someone who had no intention of fighting fair. He waited until the last possible second before throwing the Defiant Hope into a spiraling barrel roll that took him directly through the cruiser's firing solution. Energy beams passed so close that they left scorch marks on his hull, but Marcus held his course with the kind of ice-cold determination that had made him legendary among human pilots. At point-blank range, he triggered his mining laser and held the beam steady on the cruiser's hull for a full 10 seconds, long enough to carve through armor plating and into whatever vital systems lay beneath. The alien ship's elegant exterior erupted in a shower of sparks and venting atmosphere as critical systems overloaded and failed. But the effort cost him. The mining laser's power requirements had drained his ship's remaining energy reserves, and Marcus could feel the Defiant Hope's engines beginning to sputter. His quantum displacement device was burned out, his weapons were nearly exhausted, and his ship was dying around him. Time for the final act. Marcus Chen had always known he would die in space. It wasn't a morbid obsession or a death wish, just a simple acceptance of statistical probability. Deep space pilots had a life expectancy that made suicide bombers look like insurance salesmen, and Marcus had been pushing his luck for over 2 decades. The only question had been whether he'd go out in a blaze of glory, or simply disappear into the void like so many others before him. As the Defiant Hope limped through the wreckage of the Zephyrian formation, her engines sputtering on fumes and her hull held together by emergency patches and sheer willpower, Marcus felt a strange sense of peace settling over him. He'd accomplished more than anyone had a right to expect from a single pilot with a broken-down freight hauler. 2 alien ships destroyed, a flagship crippled, an entire fleet thrown into chaos, and most importantly, every human civilian evacuated safely from the system. Not a bad epitaph for a kid from the Mars colonies who'd started his career hauling ice between mining stations, but Marcus wasn't quite ready for his epitaph yet. The Zephyrians were regrouping, their damaged vessels falling back into defensive formations while fresh ships moved to replace those he'd destroyed. In a few minutes, they'd have their coordination back, and then they'd hunt him down with the methodical efficiency that had made them the terror of the galaxy. Unless he gave them something else to worry about. His tactical display showed 17 alien vessels within his immediate vicinity, including the damaged flagship that was struggling to restore power to its primary systems. The ship was massive, easily 10 times the size of the Defiant Hope and heavily armored. But Marcus had learned something important during his brief tour of its hull. The Zephyrians built their ships like living organisms, with distributed systems that could adapt and heal themselves when damaged, which meant they also had a nervous system of sorts, a network of quantum communication nodes that connected all the ship's various components, and like any nervous system, it had a central processing unit that coordinated all the signals. A brain. Marcus checked his remaining ammunition and grimaced. He had exactly 1 mining charge left, along with enough power in his mining laser for maybe 30 seconds of continuous operation. Against the flagship's heavy armor, it wouldn't be enough to cause significant damage, but if he could find the right target. Defiant Hope, this is Admiral Kowalski. Marcus, please respond. Your signal is breaking up, and we're reading massive structural damage to your vessel. Marcus keyed his transmitter, wincing as the motion sent fresh spikes of pain through his quantum-addled nervous system. Still here, Admiral. Though I have to admit the old girl's not looking too good. I think we've got maybe one more dance left in us, Marcus. Listen to me. You've done enough. More than enough. Those civilian transports are halfway to Alpha Centauri by now, and your actions have given us invaluable intelligence about Zephyrian capabilities. There's nothing more you can accomplish by staying there. Actually, Admiral, I think there might be one more thing I can try. See, I've been studying these alien ships, and I think I've figured out how their command structure works. Each vessel is basically a single massive organism, with all its systems connected by some kind of quantum neural network. Very elegant, very efficient, and potentially very vulnerable to the right kind of targeted attack. Marcus pulled up the sensor data from his close encounter with the flagship, highlighting the areas where he'd detected the strongest quantum signatures. There, near the center of the ship, buried deep within layers of armor and defensive systems, was a cluster of structures that pulsed with regular, coordinated rhythms. The Zephyrian equivalent of a brainstem. If I can get close enough to disrupt their central processing node, it might cause a cascade failure throughout their entire command network. At the very least, it would buy us time to mount a proper defense of the core systems. There was a long pause before Admiral Kowalski responded. When she did, her voice was thick with emotion. Marcus, that's a suicide run. Even if you somehow managed to penetrate their defenses and reach the target, you'd never make it out alive. I know, ma'am. But sometimes the best way to win a fight is to make sure the other guy knows you're willing to die for what you believe in. Humans have been proving that particular point for thousands of years. Marcus began plotting an intercept course toward the flagship, his fingers moving over the controls with the fluid precision of someone who had spent half his life in a pilot's chair. The Defiant Hope responded sluggishly to his commands, her damaged engines straining to build up speed for one final charge. Around him, the Zephyrian fleet was beginning to notice his movement. Interceptors peeled off from their formations to converge on his position, their weapons charging with that familiar crystalline whine. But they were being cautious now, having learned to respect the unpredictable human pilot who had already cost them 2 ships and a flagship's worth of pride. That caution would be their undoing. Marcus pushed his engines past their red line limits, accepting the risk of catastrophic failure in exchange for every possible nod of acceleration. The Defiant Hope leaped forward like a dying animal making one last desperate sprint, her hull glowing cherry red from the heat of overloaded power conduits. The first energy beam lanced past his cockpit close enough to boil paint off his hull plating. Marcus rolled away from the attack, using the flagship's own bulk as cover while he closed the distance to its central section. His proximity sensors screamed warnings as he skimmed along the alien vessel's surface, following the quantum signatures toward his target. Attention, human pilot. The Zephyrian commander's voice filled his cockpit, its crystalline tones now carrying an unmistakable note of concern. Your current course will result in your destruction. There is no logical reason for you to continue this attack. We offer you the opportunity to surrender with honor. Appreciate the offer, Marcus replied as he rolled the Defiant Hope between 2 massive weapon turrets, but I'm afraid honor isn't really what this is about. See, you made one fundamental mistake when you decided to enslave my species. You assumed we'd react logically to an overwhelming threat. The target was directly ahead now, a section of the flagship's hull that practically glowed with quantum energy signatures. Marcus armed his last mining charge and prepared to trigger his mining laser for one final burst. He wouldn't survive the attack, but he didn't need to. He just needed to prove a point that every human in the galaxy would remember for generations to come. The thing about humans, Marcus continued, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, is that we don't really do logic when someone threatens our families. We do rage, we do stubbornness. We do impossible things just to spite the universe that's trying to kill us. And most of all, we do whatever it takes to make sure our children grow up free. Marcus thought of Emily's photograph, safe in his jacket pocket, and smiled. She would grow up in a galaxy where humans were known as the species that fought back. The people who refused to be caged no matter what the odds. That was a legacy worth dying for. This is Captain Marcus Chen of the Terran Colonial Navy, he announced on an open channel that every ship in the system could hear. I want every human listening to remember this moment. Remember that one pilot in a broken-down freight hauler made an entire alien armada take notice. Remember that humans don't surrender, humans don't give up, and humans sure as hell don't make good pets. The Defiant Hope struck the flagship's hull at nearly 30% of light speed. The explosion that marked the end of the Defiant Hope was visible from the edge of the solar system. A brief, brilliant star that outshone everything else in the void for exactly 4.7 seconds before fading into memory. But those 4.7 seconds changed the course of galactic history in ways that no one could have predicted. Admiral Sarah Kowalski watched the blast from the bridge of the Indomitable, her weathered hands gripping the tactical display as the energy readings spiked off the charts. Around her, the bridge crew stood in stunned silence as they processed what they had just witnessed. A single human pilot had charged into the heart of an alien armada and detonated himself against their flagship like a living missile. But Marcus Chen's final act wasn't just a grand gesture of defiance. His mining charge, armed with an experimental quantum resonator that he'd cobbled together from salvaged Zephyrian technology, had found its mark with devastating precision. The explosion tore through the flagship's quantum neural network like a virus, sending cascading failures throughout the massive vessel's distributed systems. The effects were immediate and dramatic. The flagship's elegant hull began to ripple and distort as its organic armor lost cohesion. whole sections peeling away like diseased skin. Its weapons fell silent as power distribution networks failed, and its propulsion systems sputtered to a halt as the ship's quantum brain struggled to maintain even basic functions. But the real surprise came when the neural cascade jumped to the other Zephyrian vessels. The aliens had built their fleet to function as a single coordinated organism, with quantum communication links connecting every ship to the central command structure. Marcus's attack had turned that strength into a weakness, sending feedback loops and system failures racing through the entire formation. One by one, the alien ships began to suffer the same symptoms as their flagship. Weapon systems went offline, engines sputtered and failed, and the perfect formations that had seemed so invincible began to drift apart as individual vessels lost their ability to coordinate with the fleet. "My God," whispered Lieutenant Commander Torres from the tactical station. "The entire alien fleet is going dark. It's like they're all connected to the same network, and we just pulled the plug on their central server, Admiral." Kowalski felt a surge of pride mixed with grief as she watched the Zephyrian Armada transform from an unstoppable force into a collection of drifting hulks. Marcus had done more than just strike a blow against the enemy. He'd revealed a critical vulnerability in their entire military doctrine, but there was no time to savor the victory. Even damaged, the alien ship still represented a massive threat, and it would only be a matter of time before they adapted their systems to compensate for the neural cascade failure. The human survivors needed to exploit this window of opportunity while it lasted. "Signal all remaining vessels," Kowalski ordered. "We're going back in. I want salvage teams on those alien hulks, and I want every piece of Zephyrian technology we can get our hands on. This is our chance to level the playing field." Across the system, human ships began to emerge from their hiding places among the outer planets and asteroid fields. Vessels that had been running for their lives just minutes before now turned back toward the scene of the battle, their crews eager to honor Marcus's sacrifice by making the most of the opportunity he'd created. The Zephyrian commander, aboard the crippled flagship, watched the approaching human vessels with what could only be described as bewilderment. Its crystalline consciousness had been operating under certain assumptions about human behavior, that they were a primitive species motivated primarily by fear and self-preservation. The actions of the pilot called Marcus Chen had shattered those assumptions completely. "Status report," the commander requested from its subordinates, its mental voice tinged with confusion and something that might have been admiration. "Primary neural network is offline. Backup systems are compensating, but at only 37% efficiency. Estimated repair time is 14 standard time units, assuming no further interference." "And the human vessels?" "Approaching rapidly. They appear to be initiating some form of salvage operation on our damaged units. Shall we order defensive actions?" The commander considered this for a long moment. Under normal circumstances, the answer would have been obvious. Any species that dared to approach a Zephyrian fleet would be eliminated without hesitation. But these were not normal circumstances. The humans had just demonstrated capabilities that defied every model in the collective's extensive database. More importantly, they had displayed a level of determination that was both inspiring and terrifying. The pilot had chosen certain death rather than accept defeat, turning his own vessel into a weapon when all conventional options were exhausted. It was the kind of tactical thinking that the collective had never encountered before. "Negative," the commander decided. "Allow them to approach. We will observe their behavior and attempt to understand their motivations. This species may prove more valuable as allies than as preserved specimens." On dozens of human vessels, engineering teams worked frantically to extract alien technology from the crippled Zephyrian ships. They found quantum processors that operated on principles human science had only theorized about, energy weapons that could bend space itself, and propulsion systems that seemed to violate several fundamental laws of physics. But more importantly, they found proof that the galaxy's most feared conquerors were not invincible. The Zephyrian ships were incredibly advanced, but they were also vulnerable in ways that their builders had never considered. The neural network that allowed them to coordinate so effectively could be turned against them by an enemy clever enough to exploit its weaknesses. Dr. Elizabeth Shaw, the human fleet's chief xenotechnologist, stood in the cargo bay of the research vessel Discovery and marveled at the alien artifacts that her teams had recovered. crystalline matrices that pulsed with their own inner light, metal alloys that shifted their properties based on electromagnetic input, and data storage devices that contained the accumulated knowledge of dozens of conquered civilizations. "It's incredible," she murmured to her assistant. "These technologies are centuries ahead of anything we've developed. Maybe millennia ahead, and we're only seeing them because one crazy pilot decided to ram a freight hauler into their command ship." But Shaw understood something that the Zephyrian commander was only beginning to grasp. Technology was just one factor in any conflict. Marcus Chen hadn't defeated an alien armada with superior firepower or advanced tactics. He'd won by being willing to pay a price that his enemies couldn't comprehend. The news of the battle spread through human space like wildfire. Marcus Chen's name became synonymous with the refusal to surrender. His final words quoted by everyone from military strategists to schoolchildren. But more importantly, his actions had proved something that humanity desperately needed to believe: that even the most overwhelming odds could be overcome through courage, determination, and a willingness to sacrifice for something greater than oneself. The Zephyrian Collective, meanwhile, was forced to completely reassess its understanding of human psychology. Their vast databases, compiled from the study of dozens of primitive species, contained no reference to the kind of tactical suicide that Marcus had employed. It was an entirely new form of warfare, one that turned individual determination into a strategic weapon. For the first time in their long history of conquest, the Zephyrians found themselves facing an enemy that they couldn't predict, couldn't control, and couldn't comprehend. It was a profoundly unsettling experience for a species that had spent millennia reducing warfare to a precise science. And somewhere in the ruins of the Defiant Hope, scattered across several cubic kilometers of twisted metal and quantum debris, the photograph of a little girl named Emily Chen drifted silently through space, a small reminder of why some fights are worth winning, no matter what the cost. 3 months after the Battle of Kepler Station, the Zephyrian Collective did something that no one in the galaxy had thought possible. They requested a diplomatic meeting with humanity. Not a demand for surrender, not an ultimatum, but an actual request for negotiation between equals. The meeting took place aboard a neutral space station in the DMZ between human and Zephyrian space, a sterile environment filled with artificial gravity and recycled air that smelled faintly of ozone and metal polish. Ambassador Helen Price, humanity's chief diplomatic representative, found herself sitting across a table from a being that looked like living crystal shaped into roughly humanoid form, its body shifting and flowing with patterns of light that seemed to pulse with its thoughts. "We have come to understand," the Zephyrian delegate said in its chiming, musical voice, "that our previous assessment of your species was incomplete. The actions of the individual you call Marcus Chen have forced us to reconsider our entire approach to human integration." Ambassador Price nodded carefully. The past 3 months had been a whirlwind of activity as humanity struggled to make sense of their unexpected reprieve. The Zephyrian fleet had withdrawn from human space entirely, not in defeat but in what could only be described as confusion. For the first time in their recorded history, the collective had encountered a species that refused to fit into their carefully categorized understanding of galactic civilization. "We're prepared to discuss terms," Price replied, "but I want to be clear about humanity's position. We will not accept any form of protectorate status, and we will not be relocated to preservation zones or any other form of controlled environment. We are a free species, and we intend to remain that way." The crystalline being's patterns shifted to what the human xenopsychologists had learned to interpret as amusement. "Your position is understood and respected." The pilot Chen demonstrated that humans possess a form of strategic thinking that we had not previously encountered. The willingness to sacrifice individual existence for abstract principles is a concept that our collective consciousness finds difficult to comprehend, yet impossible to ignore. What the Zephyrian delegate didn't say, but what Ambassador Price understood perfectly, was that Marcus's sacrifice had fundamentally altered the balance of power in the galaxy. The human species had demonstrated that they possessed something that all the collective's advanced technology couldn't counter: the ability to turn individual courage into a weapon of mass destruction. The neural cascade that had crippled the Zephyrian fleet at Kepler Station had been replicated and refined by human scientists working with the alien technology they'd salvaged from the battle. What Marcus had accomplished through improvisation and desperation could now be deployed as a standard military tactic. Any Zephyrian fleet that relied on neural networking, which was to say all of them, was vulnerable to what the human military had dubbed the Chen Gambit. But the real change went deeper than military tactics. Word of the battle had spread throughout the galaxy, reaching species that had been conquered and preserved by the Zephyrian collective centuries ago. For the first time in generations, these enslaved civilizations began to believe that resistance was possible. On the former homeworld of the Altarian Republic, now a carefully managed preserve, where the surviving members of that once proud species lived in artificial habitats designed to maintain their cultural authenticity, a young Altarian named Korvek stood before a hidden gathering of his people and spoke words that would have been unthinkable just months before. "The humans have shown us that the collective is not invincible," he said, his forearms gesturing emphatically as he addressed the crowd of rebels. One pilot in one ship brought their entire fleet to its knees. Imagine what we could accomplish if we fought together, if we coordinated our efforts across all the preserved worlds. Similar meetings were taking place on dozens of worlds across Zephyrian space. The Thurian mining collectives were stockpiling explosives in their forced labor camps. The aquatic deepsworn were sabotaging the underwater facilities where they were kept as living museums. Even the peaceful green thumb agriculturalists were beginning to poison the crops they were forced to grow for their captors. The Zephyrian collective, faced with the possibility of simultaneous rebellions on dozens of worlds, was discovering that maintaining an empire built on subjugation required more resources than they had imagined. Their perfect, efficient system of control was unraveling because one human pilot had refused to accept the inevitable. Back in human space, Marcus Chen's sacrifice was being honored in ways both grand and intimate. The Terran Colonial Navy had commissioned a new class of fast attack ships called the Chen class, each one equipped with quantum displacement drives and neural cascade weapons. The military academy on Mars had established the Chen Institute for Asymmetric Warfare, dedicated to studying unconventional tactics that could level the playing field against superior forces. But perhaps the most fitting memorial was the small plaque that had been installed in the pilot-ready room of every human military vessel. It bore a simple message that had become the unofficial motto of the Colonial Navy. When the odds are impossible, remember Marcus Chen. When surrender seems logical, remember the defiant hope. When they tell you to accept defeat, remind them that humans don't make good pets. Emily Chen, now 9 years old and living with her grandmother on Europa, didn't fully understand why her father's photograph had become one of the most famous images in human space. She knew that he had been a pilot, and that he had died fighting bad aliens who wanted to hurt people, but the details of his final mission were still too complex for her to grasp. What she did understand was that people spoke of her father with a mixture of awe and sadness that made her feel proud and lonely at the same time. Teachers would smile at her in a special way when they learned her name, and complete strangers would sometimes thank her for her father's service without explanation. On the anniversary of the Battle of Kepler Station, Emily stood with her grandmother before the memorial that had been built in Marcus's honor, a simple stone monument that listed the names of all the civilian ships that had escaped the system because of his sacrifice. At the top of the list, in letters large enough to read from orbit, were the words, "Captain Marcus Chen, TCS Defiant Hope. He showed the galaxy what it means to be human." As Emily placed a small bouquet of flowers at the base of the monument, she whispered a promise to the father she would never see again. "I'll remember, Daddy. I'll always remember that you were brave." Across the galaxy, the ripples of Marcus Chen's final act continued to spread. The Zephyrian collective, once the unchallenged masters of known space, now found themselves negotiating with species they had previously regarded as curiosities. Trade agreements replaced conquest fleets. Cultural exchanges took the place of preservation programs. The galaxy was becoming a more complicated, more chaotic, and ultimately more free place. And on 1,000 different worlds in 100 different languages, beings who had never heard of Earth or humanity told stories about a pilot who flew into certain death because he refused to let his daughter live in a cage. The details changed with each telling. Sometimes Marcus was a giant who breathed fire. Sometimes his ship was the size of a moon. Sometimes he fought 1,000 battles before his final sacrifice. But the core of the story remained the same. One individual, faced with impossible odds, had chosen to fight rather than surrender. He had turned his own life into a weapon and used it to strike a blow for freedom that would echo through the ages. It was, the storytellers agreed, a very human thing to do. In the end, Marcus Chen got exactly what he'd always wanted, to make sure his daughter grew up free. But he had done something even more important than that. He had reminded the galaxy that freedom was worth fighting for, no matter what the cost, and sometimes that reminder was all it took to change everything.